I'm here with Michael Granberry, an animator who worked on some of the most iconic stop motion films over the last decade, with movies like Charlie Kaufman's Anomalisa, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, and Henry Selick's Wendell Wild. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start off with a bit more like general questions about stop motion and about you, and then we're
Sure.
gonna circle back more to the movies. Um,
Okay.
Was the plan always to become a stop motion animator, or did you ever consider like going into 2D or even CG animation?
Oh gosh. Actually it was my first plan. My father introduced me to stop motion when I was about 8 or 9 years old by taking me to see this screening of an old film from 1958 called The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which had all this animation by the great Ray Harryhausen, sword
Mhm.
fighting skeletons and giant cyclops. And my little child brain just exploded. And immediately I was obsessed with it. And so he explained to me how it was done. And then I talked to my parents into getting me my first camera when I was around 10. They wouldn't buy it for me before then because they thought I would just drop it in the mud or something. So I got my first camera and I actually started making little stop motion films with a Super 8 millimeter film. And I did that for a few years. And around the time I turned 14, CGI came along. And suddenly, all of the trade magazines I was reading were saying stop motion is dead. There's not going to be any more stop motion. Computers are going to do everything now. And I was just heartbroken. I didn't live in like Los Angeles or New York or places where there were big art schools. I was living in rural Georgia, where, just farmland. So, I mean, it was amazing. I even knew what I did know. So since I couldn't, I figured, well, I can't pursue this. So I'll pursue the other thing I like to do, which was live theater. My parents had gotten me and my siblings into children's theater really young. And so I just sort of poured everything into that. And I studied it in high school and I went to college on a theater scholarship and I got work right out of college. And I did that for about 20 years. And then, ironically, computers, which had killed stop motion, brought it back because people figured out how to use digital cameras to take still images the way you would with a movie camera and play it in a sequence. And one of the big things it did was it took out the cost of film and processing. And so suddenly, people like myself who had grown up watching stop motion and it had suddenly disappeared but had this great nostalgia for it, now they're running studios, and so they're like, well, we should try to do a stop motion show and let's just do some stop motion things here and there. And then suddenly it went from being this thing that almost never happened to something everybody wanted to get into. And because there weren't a lot of people around who had had an opportunity. A lot of us who didn't have a lot of experience, but a lot of enthusiasm, were able to get internships or be hired as assistants onto these shows. And there were some really terrific animators, like on the first seasons of Robot Chicken, shows like that on Adult Swim. Um, and we learned from them. We all kind of learned together, like what looks good, how to do it on a TV schedule, which is pretty fast. And I mean, from that moment on, it was like a dam exploded in my head, and that 14-year-old kid just came charging out, like, I'm gonna do this. I don't care if I, don't make a dime. I have to pursue this thing that I've wanted to do. And ironically, all the skills that I had learned working in theater were applicable to stop motion, building sets, making costumes, lighting, choreographing for a proscenium, which is basically your screen. So in a way, even though I didn't technically know how to animate like people who had gone to animation school, I had acting skills and choreography skills that people took a look at my animation and said, how long have you been doing this? I was like, about a month, but but it was they showed me, they taught me the language of how to animate well technically, and then I was able to bring these other things to it. But it was odd that because I was older than most of the people who were coming out, they were right out of college, and I was in my mid 30s by that point. People thought I'd been doing it forever. They just never heard of me for some reason. Like, where have you been?
Have been hiding in the
I
shadows.
sort of snuck in, yeah, through the side door.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a small community. The stop motion community is vanishingly small, and on a global scale. So, I mean, the general emotion that I seem to be met with was, if you're crazy enough to want to do this, come on in.
We even on the podcast we talked about the movie Stop Motion that came out last year,
Oh
the horror
yeah,
film. Yeah,
yes.
and we joked about like there's this scene where a few horror stop motion animators sit together at like a dinner table, and we joked about that those are like the entirety of stop motion horror animators existing in the world all came together for this scene.
Exactly. We all just keep running around and changing costumes in front of each other so people can't tell. There's only five of us.
Um,
Oh.
you already mentioned like you gotta be kind of a crazy person to wanna do this. Are you generally a super patient person, or is it something about stop motion that gets you relaxed, that lets you do
Mm,
this?
yeah, I would say there's something I I feel like in patience is something that I do struggle with sometimes. It's because I like to see results, but also it's one of the things that drives me to get through stop motion, because it can be incredibly tedious and laborious, but I want to see the finished shot. So I've got this fire in me that's saying I can't wait to see this when it's done. So that, keeps kind of, pushing. And sometimes, you really have to slow down. Like, if you're trying to do a very, sensitive, careful, scene, if things are moving really quickly, then the moves, the individual increments every frame are much larger. So, it can get really exciting. But if you're doing like a very thoughtful, contemplative scene, with characters who are just barely moving, then the increments, the moves every frame are just tiny. They're so tiny, and that, is really, can really test you, because everything that you're touching with your giant hands, big clumsy fingers, looks, something that's like a millimeter, can look like you just knocked it a foot and a half. It's
Mm.
crazy. So there can be, there's all sorts of little devices, little rigs that are just little, with little winders on them, that can just pull puppets, infinitesimal amounts. And I have friends who work on, major motion pictures, and when you see things on a screen that's, like an IMAX screen or something like that, when the biggest movement on screen is the character breathing, that requires patience, and that requires so much control, and that
Mhm.
and it can take, weeks, to get through something like that. So, you I don't know. I tend to like things that are a little more fast paced than chaotic, personally.
Fair enough. I can see how
Yeah.
it will test you if you have such a steam. Do you have like a preferred material to work with in stop motion? Both like the
Oh.
actual process, but also maybe visually speaking?
Mm. I do like sort of three-dimensional puppets. Actual characters are usually sort of in the range of about 8 to 13 inches tall, which is a good size for animating. And it's enough space that you can get good detail if you're the one, making such characters. If they get much smaller than that, they don't have enough surface area to get a whole lot of detail. Though now with 3D printing, you can get a lot more detail on a much smaller surface. I don't have those kinds of capabilities in my own studio, but I do get to work with them outside of that. But also, when things start to get too small, they can be, really, like we said, it's hard to move them in little increments and things like that. But I like just three-dimensional sets. A lot of my sets, they look like live action sets just shrunk down. And
Mhm.
what one of the reasons I like that so much is it does what stop motion does naturally that other forms of animation does not. It captures texture and it captures light. We have real cameras, we have real lights. We're not digitally creating the lights, though we can amplify them if we need to. But if you look at like a Pixar film or a Disney film, and you read the end credits, and you get to the teams that do like texture, like just hair, and there'll be like 100 people just listed to do the hair, or 100 people just to do water or leaves or things like that, just to get that natural texture. In stop motion, it's there. You when you're making the props or the character, you're deciding what is this texture going to be, what's it going to look like. You can put it in front of a camera, you can put light on it, see what it's going to look like, see how it animates. And I like that tactility about it. And I think you can see that, at least for me, you see that the best in like three-dimensional models. And the parallax is always changing. If as the characters move, you see different sides of them. As the camera moves, you see different parts of the set. And everything you're looking at is something that someone spent hours making, and laboriously trying to make perfect for this world. And I love that. I love seeing that, it's a performance. It's just all these little gifts that people make. That being said, depending upon what the project is, I think there's a different, cool thing to do with stop motion. Like people animate, paper on flat surfaces using what they call a down shooter, which is basically a camera that's just positioned so that it's pointing straight down, and then you're animating on like a glass tabletop or something like that, which is the way that the old Disney animators used to shoot the 2D movies, and that can be magical and fascinating as well. There's people who animate just food. There's people who,
Mhm.
animate, just paint. I saw an unbelievable film at Slash Film Festival in Vienna called Weeds. That was all done with oil paint on glass. And I mean, you think about the patience that it takes to paint every frame of your movie. And it just brought me to tears. It was a beautiful film, first of all, but second, just knowing what the filmmaker did to bring this beautiful story, timeless gift, to the world,
Mhm.
is something that I deeply respect, and something I would love to try someday.
That's amazing. Yeah, I once saw something similar with like someone made a short, I think it like 20 minutes long with animated in sand. So like
Oh,
on a glass
yes.
pane. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sand animation. Crazy. And the people who devote themselves to it learn all these different techniques, like how deep the sand is makes gives you the value of the light that you're going to see, because usually there's
Mhm.
light underneath it. And so a very thin layer of sand, more light will come through it. But if they thicken the sand, it makes it darker. So they manage to get these three-dimensional looking images just by controlling the depth of the layer of sand. I mean, how does your brain work
Yeah.
like that?
It's incredible.
It's incredible.
You already earlier mentioned Ray Harryhausen. If
Mm.
remember correctly, you once got to talk to him or meet him or something. Can
I
you talk about
did.
that?
I absolutely could talk about that. It was in San Diego at San Diego Comic-Con, which is huge. I mean,
Mhm.
it's so big now. I don't know if I could even get into the building because it has grown so much. But the first time I went was in 2005, and I had finished my first uh, stop motion film, not counting the ones I made as a child, but my first grown person stop motion that I'd done, and it got into the Comic Con Film Festival, and so I went down there for that, and it had dinosaurs and it had all this stuff. And Ray Harryhausen was there speaking on a panel, but his panel was at the same time as my screening. And so went to my screening. The screening went great. There was a Q&A afterwards, and as soon as it was over, I bolted and I ran to where Ray was having his panel, and I made it in. I saw about the last half of it. It was in a huge meeting hall that was just completely packed, and so I stood in the back and I saw about half of it. And afterwards, he was being taken to another place where he was going to be autographing a new book of his film about his films that had come out. And he was going out one way and I was going the other, and there was just this sea of people, everywhere. So there's absolutely no way I could get anywhere close to him. But then as I was just walking through the hall, a friend of mine just started waving frantically and like pointing down. And I was like, what are you doing? And I saw, and then coming through the crowd was a Comic-Con volunteer pushing a wheelchair. And Ray was in the wheelchair, because there was a great distance between the hall and where he had to go, and so many people. They were just, and he was elderly, so they're like, that's how you get around, at a
Yeah.
place that's that way, so they were just pushing him through, and he came right by me. So I just got lockstep in with that very fast moving wheelchair, and I just told him how much his work meant to me, and that I just had the premiere of my first stop motion film, and it was full of dinosaurs, and it was all inspired by his work. And thank you, thank you, thank you. And he was so kind and gracious, and just said all the
That's
nice things. And I must have looked insane because I was just hyperventilating, to be talking to the person whose work like triggered all of this.
Mhm.
But it was a really special moment for me.
Yeah, I believe it. Oh my God, that sounds incredible. A little bit back to the more work side. What's the
Sure.
biggest difference with stop motion when it comes to working on feature films versus television series?
Mm. The biggest difference is definitely the schedule, because television is fast and there's just no getting around it. Stop motion, for a long time, people were saying that CGI was preferable to stop motion because uh, stop motion just takes way longer than CGI. But at some point, it kind of flipped. And suddenly, once people realized, like, ooh, look what we can do with CGI, and, they started like getting down really into the weeds of it, and spending all this time. Whereas with stop motion, it's like, well, we've got this. If now that we can do it digitally, we just have to develop a way to animate quickly, because no one really teaches stop motion animators how to do the task. They teach you this is how it's done, but how do you actually do it when you get onto a stage? And so everybody kind of figures it out for themselves. And some people have a very slow process of doing it. Some people just crash into it, really quickly. And and what I found is that because when I started making films again, I still had no animation training. If something looked good, I didn't know why. And if something looked bad, I didn't know why. So I was just like, well, I might as well just go for it and see what happens. It's going to look like something, and I'll learn something. And there's something about, when you just sort of propel yourself through stop motion, that your work may be rough, but you'll get better over time. And eventually you start making the correct decisions without, because you see them, when I work with interns or with students, I just encourage them just to go as fast as possible. It's better to look at like 300 frames that aren't very good than 10 frames that are perfect.
Mm.
There's just not that much to talk about, because when you can see something that doesn't work, you'll never do it again, or you'll remember, oh, this looks like that. So maybe there's a special circumstance where that would work.
Mm.
But most of the time you'll see why that didn't work, and your fingers will just not do it. So um, you have to learn on a TV schedule to animate well quickly, or be able to animate very fast, but have it also look good. So you make certain choices. Okay, maybe all the background characters are just standing still while one character talks, whereas like in a feature film that might look robotic or artificial, so everybody's moving. And also, because movie screens are so huge, usually the increments in which you're moving characters, you're much smaller. I mean, now when we work on TV shows, we have to remind ourselves that a lot of people aren't even watching our show on a TV. A lot of people are
Mm.
watching it, on a phone, or a tablet or something like that. So um, it's more forgiving in a way. But television schedules are they're never going to say, oh, just take as much time as you need. Because
Mm.
it's just it's fundamentally different from a scheduling standpoint. With films, it's a much longer development time. And anytime somebody said, oh, we're going to do this film really fast, we're going to get it done really quick, I've never seen that happen. I've never ever seen a film roll in before its original delivery date. It's always much later, because
Mhm.
things happen, or things start to grow. Anomalisa was an incredible example of that. When I was first brought on to that, it was going to be 45 minutes. Basically, it was going to be like a long short film. And it was going to be like 10 animators, and we're going to shoot it in 10 weeks. And I was like, wow, okay, that sounds doable, at 45 minutes. But then, it started to actually get made, and everyone saw how good it was looking, but how long it took to get it to look that good, and it's like, well, okay, we don't want to shortchange, the quality. So what if we just, push a little bit more? And then as Charlie Kaufman got more involved with it, and started to like just make discoveries and things about that film, they started working on, more scenes. And then suddenly it's like, wait, it's growing. How's it going to grow? And so I eventually, I mean, I actually wasn't on it very long, because, I had just committed to those 10 weeks. And I only worked on it for about 2 weeks, because my start time got pushed by 8. So I had already signed a contract to begin another show. So I had to leave after I did my very short scene, the shower scene in Anomalisa, and went off, and I shot 2 seasons of another TV show before Anomalisa was done. And it just became like this legend. I was like saying, people are still working on Anomalisa. It's still going. And it just kept going and going. And so when they finally had the crew screening and I just didn't know what to expect. I was like, what is this going to be? They've been holed up in there forever. And, and so I went in just not knowing what to expect. And it blew my mind. I could not believe how great it was, how funny it was, how beautiful it was. And, none of the things that I was reacting to were in the original script, were in the original, just little bits of it. It just knocked me out. And I was like, that's what happens when you allow something to breathe and evolve, creatively, instead of being, boxed in by, this is your schedule, this is your budget, that's it. And films can have that freedom in a way that TV can't. when people do something really fantastic in television, whether it's live action or animation, I stand up and cheer because you know what they're up against time wise.
I love that you already brought up the shower scene of Anomalisa. I'm pretty
Mm.
sure with that you kind of made film history. I think it has to be the first stop motion animated penis in feature film history since it became a feature film over time. So congratulations,
it
I guess.
it was, thank you. Well, it was definitely mine.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mention that because there was when the film came out, a reviewer said almost the exact same thing.
Oh,
Said
really?
this is the first film where you will see a stop motion animated penis. And then they went on to say, I'm paraphrasing, can you imagine being the animator and having to have that conversation and tell that to your parents? And I gasped because I did have that conversation with my parents.
That's
I was like,
amazing.
guess what I did? I did
What?
the first
How
stop
was
motion
that
animated penis in
conversation?
history. Oh, they were so proud. They were so proud. They're like, well done.
Amazing, amazing.
I
That's
mean, by that
incredible.
point, yeah, by that point, I had done, a lot of Robot Chicken and,
Mhm.
things for Adult Swim. So, horror movies and things like that. So it
Eh,
was probably pretty tame
yeah,
by comparison.
yeah. It's just
Uh,
so funny that this really serious adult animated movie is like the kind of the first apparently in that regard.
yeah, and I felt like I was really lucky because the film it didn't have a lot of lighthearted moments. It did once it was done. I mean, once you saw it completed, there were, moments of humor, but in the original script and the animatic, it was not. I mean, it was like that character, the main character, whose name is also Michael, is also who just was he was in such a dark place. And so I was really happy I had one of the actual legitimately funny scenes, of just a character trying to get the water temperature right, and just screaming fuck fuck fuck, just over and over and over again. And Charlie Kaufman came in and, saw the scene and he laughed. So it's like, oh, I was just like, I'll just be happy forever that I got to make one of my favorite writers laugh out loud. So
Yeah, it's definitely an
yes.
achievement.
Yeah. Yes, he's got a reputation where people think that he's a very, dark, depressed human being, and he is not at all. He's just just a guy out trying to write and sell scripts like the rest of us. And, he's very practical, but the way he, interprets things is in such a singularly fun and funny way that I think celebrates, you know, our all of our all of our flaws, all of our little things that he finds really really precious about humanity. And God, I just love his work for that. I was really thrilled to work on that film, even on that short little scene.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand why. It's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Oh,
It really is. And
likewise.
yeah. Speaking of like heroes, what was the relation to Del Toro? Like how much was your involvement in that movie in
Oh,
Pinocchio?
yeah, Pinocchio. Gosh, it was I wish it had been more,
Hmm.
but it was unique. There was another film, Henry Selick film called Wendell and Wild, that was gearing up for production slightly after, or slightly before Pinocchio. So both of them were basically in pre-production at the same time, and Netflix was producing both of them. And I was very fortunate to be hired onto what was essentially going to be like a proof of concept test for Wendell and Wild at Netflix in Hollywood, and it kept growing and growing until it was like, oh, we're actually doing if this movie gets greenlit, this is going to be a scene in the film, and it was, and so I was actually
Which scene was that? Just curious.
It's the very first scene where you see Wendell and Wild, and they are coming up. Oh, they're riding on this cart that's being pulled by this giant uh, bug creature that's drilling holes, and they're planting hair plugs in their father who's losing his hair, and so they're on this giant scalp. And that first scene with Wendell and Wild, where we see them, was the scene that we shot in LA. And so we were working on that scene, and working with the great Henry Selick, who I absolutely adore working with. And so that was already, every day was incredible. And then this one day, I remember working on the scene, and they said Guillermo del Toro is here, and he's coming to tour our sets because he and Henry know each other. And I was like, whoa, because that's, I try to be very, I lived in LA for 60 years. And so I try to be, and there's always celebrities coming through, and I'm very good about not losing my cool. I just very, just they're people, don't stress them out. Don't put them on the spot. But boy, he walked into my stage, and I just flat out said, I'm not even going to try to be cool. I love your work. I love your work. And he was wonderful. And, he was looking at all of the, I was working on a scene that had this very complicated, rig with all of these dials and things moving this huge character around. And he was just blown away by it. He was just like, wow, look at all of this points of articulation. This is, incredible technology. And he said, in Mexico, all we have is toothpicks and bubble gum. And I just happened to be on this giant rig that I was using, a toothpick with a piece of wax that looked like a piece of chewed up bubble gum, like stuck onto it to help me measure it. And I just pointed to that and I said, there's always a place for toothpicks and bubble gum. And he loved that. And, so it was great. And he stayed there and we talked for quite a while. And then several months went by. Our movie was greenlit, and Pinocchio was also greenlit. And I was going to came from Los Angeles up to Portland, where I'm now based, to meet my team up here, and also to look for a house. And so I got on the plane, and as I was boarding, I look over in first class, and there's Guillermo del Toro sitting on the plane. And so I kind of did that thing where, like, he looked up and we made eye contact, and I looked away really quick, and he looked away. And so I was like, because I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable. But then I was like, was that really him? And I looked again, and he looked back at me, and we both looked away again really quick. And I was like, oh, that's definitely him. And I was like, he's going up to talk to the team at Shadow Machine about Pinocchio, and I'm going up to talk to the team at Wendell and Wild. So when we got off the plane, I sort of like quickly made because he got off the plane before I did. Obviously, I was in the back, so I had to run, and I like ran, and then I started walking and just, oh, hello. It was just acting all casual. I was like, you probably don't remember me, but we met down there, on Wendell and Wild, and he's like, oh, of course, and I believe he did. I think that's why he did, like the little double take. He's like, do I know that guy? But so we got to talk just walking through the airport, and he's asking me like, what's your schedule? And I told him, and he's like, that's ours too. And he's like, what's your budget? I was like, I don't know. It's like this. And he was just like asking me all these, fun, geeky stop motion questions. And then, we got to, the entrance to the airport, and he gave me a big hug, and he's like, oh, this is a great omen. Things are going to go, so well. And so he just left, and I was like, that was magical. And so
It
then
sounds
we go
like it.
through years later, and finally, it was right at the end. We finished Wendell and Wild a couple of months before Pinocchio finished. And so most of us who finished, because Pinocchio took a little bit longer, they were losing some of their animators who had already signed contracts for their next jobs, and they went on to something else. And I just happened to be one of the people who was available and got to work on I worked on the sequence where Pinocchio and Geppetto and Spazzatura, the monkey, and the cricket are escaping from the whale, the dogfish, as they call it, where he's lying and they're telling him to lie, and he's telling lies so that his nose will grow into a whole tree that spans this chasm, so they can run across it and get out. And that was a scene that was actually came up later, because I think the original scene was very different and didn't have much action to it, and so that scene came about, from a concern that it needed to be more exciting. And they said, well, we, don't have any more animators. They're all leaving, and Netflix is, gonna, freak out if we extend, I think Guillermo del Toro was like, well, what are they gonna do? Do they want to just shut down the movie? Because it's great. My first day on Pinocchio, I got to watch the build of the film up to that point, and it was about 80% done at that point, and I was just blown away. I was like, I just came running out of the screening room just telling everybody, this is beautiful. This is one of the most gorgeous pieces of art I've ever seen. Everyone was so exhausted at that point. They were like, get out of my face. I can't even talk to you right now. And so I had all this new kid energy, and they were just running on fumes, which was fair because, they were given everything every single day for years. And so I did get to sneak on at the end, and I got to do some funny stuff, and just some big physical stuff. All of my scenes were my three favorite flavors: fast, dark, and far away. So, it was a lot of action, and so I could kind of just sort of jump in, and just kind of go for it. But it was great. And he was directing us remotely, on Zoom. And it was nice. So I had those three encounters with him, and all of I did 5 shots, and they're all in the film. So I was really happy to have that little moment.
Incredible. You already mentioned working on Wendell and Wild. You
Mm.
lead animator there, according to your IMDb credit. What exactly is the difference between like a general animator credit and a lead animator?
Uh, it's 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 a wonderful job. It's a wonderful position. Typically, lead animator is the animators who are brought on first. They're sort of early in the project, and a lot of times they are the animators who help figure out how the personalities of the characters. A lot of times they're the first animators who will ever take the puppets out onto a stage and actually animate them. So they're the ones who are figuring out if there's problems in the armature, like, oh, look, his neck, the character's head, bumps against the shoulder plate or something like that, or we need to extend the length of this, or the character has trouble standing up because of the way the fasteners in the tie downs in the feet are placed. They're it's like being, the pilot for a prototype of a race car. It's just like, take it out, drive it around, crash it into a few walls, and help us find where the problems are. It's fun in a way because you're handed these puppets, these characters that people have spent weeks and weeks designing, and you take it out and try to do something. The very first thing that happens is it breaks, or it doesn't break, or it works wonderfully. But a lot of times they're the ones who are tasked with finding the limitations, of the performance that you can get out of whatever it is, and either fixing the problem or having to like find a workaround of the problem, or sometimes just finding things that, the puppet should just never do. Like, oh, this puppet looks great from almost every angle, but at a certain angle, they look horrible. Or, there's like, we there was a TV show that I worked on called Tumbleleaf, which is a wonderful preschool stop motion animated show, and had these great character designs. But the characters had these big eyes kind of in the middle of their face, and they were little animals, and they had sort of like muzzles sort of in the middle of their face, so it was almost like eye muzzle eye, and it looked great. But if they tilted their head too far back, it looked like their features flipped upside down. Like for some reason, it just created this bizarre, optical illusion. So it's like, okay, we can't do that,
Hmm.
so that became a thing we can't do. So you just have to sort of, go in and like, what's the good side? Like, ideally a character looks great from every angle. So you never have to think about that. But occasionally they don't, and you have to avoid certain angles or they look weird. There's times when, and like I said, if the armature may have problems to it, so they can be involved fairly early on. And I was the first animator who was brought on to Wendell and Wild to do some effects testing, and then we got to work with the puppets, and they the proportions on them were quite insane. They just had these tiny little, almost needle like, arms and legs, which took these tiny little joints for the elbows, almost like the smallest little, hinge you've ever seen in there. And you couldn't tighten it too much because it would just break because it was so
Hmm.
small. So it's a lot of involved in the R&D, and then taking what you learn and giving it to the rest of the animators, dispersing that knowledge to the rest of the team, because you have to sort of achieve like a hive mind quality within your team, so that if two different animators have shots that are linked together, a character is going da 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 da, you don't want to suddenly see a character going da 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 da, they have to look like it was all animated by the same person,
Hmm.
and that can be tough to get into. You have to be sort of a chameleon as an animator so that you can wear the same suit that everybody else is wearing, and it looks like the same person's wearing it all over the place. And so the lead animators, yeah, they come on a little bit before everybody else, and then they help figure all of that stuff out and help everybody else. And depending upon the project, they can take on other roles too. The animation team usually has either an animation supervisor or animation director. Those titles are sort of interchangeable.
Hmm.
And if that person is out, then a lead animator in most cases should be able to step in and sort of do that, and then they're acting as sort of the liaison between the director and the animators, to translate the director's vision into things that animators can understand and that they can do well, and to support them. So it's fun. I mean, you really get to see how stuff is made, from the floor up. It can be challenging if you're given, something like on Wendell and Wild, specifically the character of the giant bug. His name is Sparkplug.
Oh yeah.
Has like, multiple rows of legs, and is all, sort of, all this intricate gears and things like that. And
But was that the big rig you were working on when Del Toro walked in?
yes,
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
it was absolutely. And so, figuring out, this character, like I thought, oh, I saw the design and I was like, ooh, that looks like a problem. And
Hmm.
so one of my first day on the Netflix lot, they wanted Henry Selick wanted to test, this thing just walking, just sort of, just move across the screen. And I thought, okay, no problem. I can handle this. It's basically just, turning these little knobs and making sure it doesn't go too fast so that you can really see the mechanics, of the legs. And and I thought, all right, this is great. And I think I can, handle this. I wasn't too nervous. And then he said, let's put a second camera on it from a different angle. And then I was like, oh, because the more angles you see
Yeah.
it from, like there's no wiggle room for error in there. It's like if
Mm.
it's just this, I could probably get away with a little bit of sliding, if it wasn't perfect. But boy, as soon as you put a second camera from like a 3/4 angle on, it's like now you're going to see every mistake. My first time ever touching this thing. And because we were going trying to get a lot of tests done in a day, he wanted me basically to like get this thing in like an hour to like see like a second worth of walking, and I
Yeah.
was just like, oh, every day I thought I'm going to get fired, you're going to get fired, but I never, obviously I didn't, but that's where your head goes,
Mhm.
when you're under the gun like that. But so it's things like that. You're working with the very first version of everything, and you just have to sort of remember it's a process. It's going to be fine, and not let the pressure get to you.
Mhm. With the character design of specifically Wendell and Wild, the
Mm-hmm.
name-giving characters, we were wondering if those two actually had the problem of certain perspectives not working out. Uh, my
Mm.
podcast co-host, when we talked about it, mentioned that he had the feeling he almost only saw them barely from like a varying angle, those two in
Mm.
particular.
He got it. I think he got that exactly right.
Mm.
The characters, one of the reasons I love Henry's films is because if it's a neat design, he wants to try things that haven't been done necessarily. And so with the original designs of Wendell and Wild, particularly their faces, they were kind of what we call it 2.5D. It's not quite 3D
Mhm.
because it basically it's designed to be seen from the front, but on the back it's flat. It's like a cookie, in a way. It's like it's got all this stuff, but then the back is just sheer. And he had been experimenting with this on an earlier project. The Shadow King, I think it was called, and
Mhm.
where he had these 3-dimensional bodies, but the face, in order to do facial replacements more, I think more cost effectively. Basically, it's just like it's almost like a mask.
Mm.
And as with any mask, its best angle is from the front. You can only go about this far or about this far before you start to see off the edge. And so he wanted to do Wendell and Wild that way. So their bodies were completely 3-dimensional, except for the faces, which had these, which could not be seen, from too extreme of a side angle. So thankfully, because of my theater background, I've done a ton of work with masks in the past, and was used to teaching actors how to sort of handle this, and how do you constantly face the front without looking artificial, and without it looking strange. And so I was able to kind of slip into that. But there were issues with this because as opposed to the 3-dimensional heads where they had like a separate forehead and lower portion of the face that could be interchanged, it was all just one piece, which meant that the entire face came off for every frame. So that meant there were no eyes
Mm.
left there. So their pupils had to be taken off of every face and put back onto the next face in exactly the same spot where they were. and also their little prison hats that they had to be taken off and lined up, perfectly every single frame. So as they're going, it's like I'm taking the faces off and swapping them, but I had to like transfer the pupils, and get them lined up exactly where they were in the previous frame.
That's insane.
So I spent a lot of time just making sure, because otherwise, the
The eyes
pupils would have
chitter,
just
yeah.
been, yeah, exactly, just vibrating, and the same thing with the hat. Luckily, the hats had stripes on them, so it was kind of, I could just line up the stripes.
Mm.
But that
When
was, yeah, that's how it worked in the underworld. But when they came out of the underworld and they joined the human population in the world above, they were made like the other puppets, where they had detachable,
mm.
foreheads and and lower jaws, and they, so they didn't have any of those particular issues. It was just when they were in hell, we were in hell. So
Sounds like it, yeah. So after meeting Ray Harryhausen, Guillermo del Toro, Henry Selick, and Charlie Kaufman, are there any heroes left you'd really want to work with?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, definitely. They're, a lot of them are people who, may not be as widely known, but, they're certainly very, very revered in the animation industry. The Aardman team, the people who make the wonderful, Wallace and Gromit films, are Chicken Run and
Mhm.
Shaun the Sheep, just everyone involved, with that milieu, is just they're so charming in what they make, and I love their films. I've never had an opportunity to go over and meet those folks. But they're just doing some beautiful, beautiful work. And I revere their aesthetic. And gosh, there are truly a lot. There's a team that I got to meet uh, in Montreal last year at the Fantasia Film Festival, called Clyde Henry Productions, who many
Mhm.
years ago created a film called Madame Tootly Pootly, which was a very unique short film, um, basically about a woman on a train, and it's a very much a metaphor for life. But they made a very incredible technical decision to composite live human beings' eyes onto the stop motion puppets. And if you've never seen it, it's a glorious effect. I mean, the animation itself is beautiful and the design is beautiful, but hiring actors to just be the eyes of the characters, and I think they spent like a year, just adding that, to this already beautifully constructed film. They truly are the windows to the soul, and this story just has an incredible amount of weight. I did get to meet them, and I am just hoping upon hope that someday they'll, I just was like, I will work for you for nothing. I will do I will just to be here in this aesthetic, and they could not have been more kind. And so I there's people that I do hope to work with. But you never know like who's gonna just suddenly, you could be working along and get a phone call or an email, and just a wild project just lands in your lap. So I just like to stay open to all the possibilities.
Do you have something lined up right now that you're working on, or what was the most recent thing you worked on?
I got a call from a producer about a television show that had just come out, that I hadn't seen yet, but all the cool friends of mine were telling me, "You've got to see this show. You've got to see this show," and it's called Severance. It's on Apple Plus TV, and is directed by Ben Stiller. And they said they're they want to do a sequence in stop motion for their upcoming season. And so I was like, oh, that show, I been meaning to watch it. So I went and I watched I watched the first episode and then I immediately watched the entire thing because it was so, I was like, what? And then I watched it again and I was just like, I have to work on this, So a couple of days later, I was having a Zoom meeting with the producer and with Ben Stiller, and he's telling me his vision. I was getting all into it, and so we wound up filming this sequence that I won't spoil for you if you haven't seen it. That's it's in the first episode of the second season,
Mhm.
and it was just that was an incredible thing. But it was 2 years ago because it takes a long time to make a show of high quality. Plus, we had a writer strike that went on for a long time, an actor strike that went on for a long time. So there was this long pause, but it just premiered a couple of weeks ago, and so we finally can, share behind the scenes videos and pictures and things like that. And just the response on that has been huge. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is great. So everybody thinks, well, this just came, oh, this is what you just did. It's like, no, I did that 2 years ago and it's finally arrived, and we can
Yeah.
finally, talk about it. So at this moment, I'm sort of working on on another short film. I like to make short films sort of in my, I don't have a lot of spare time, but I like to just sort of I like to make things. And so I was inspired by going to a lot of film festivals this last year with a short film that I made called Les Bêtes, which was in the Slash Film Festival where we met.
Mhm.
And the just seeing so many wonderful, horror films and horror short films, I thought, wow, this would really be, it got me very excited to, do something that was like a straight up horror movie. So I had this adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft short story that I had been tooling around with a few years ago. And I just kind of brought it out and, looked at it and I thought, well, there's aspects of it that I like and a lot of aspects of it that I don't like. Maybe I'll just focus on the aspects that I like and just sort of see where it goes. So I thought it was actually kind of an interesting metaphor for sort of U.S. history in a way, and I just thought, well, depending upon where we go culturally, it could be more, or it could be a more apt metaphor, and so I'm kind of playing around with that. I know I'm being very cryptic right now, but
Sounds good.
short horror movie, something that
H.P.
could just be,
Lovecraft.
a straight up horror film, or could also sort of work on sort of a metaphorical level. So I'm just messing around with that right now, and there's a lot of projects kind of popping around, but our whole industry right now is still sort of waking up again after, like I said, the effects of the long strikes, and Los Angeles has been dealing with some terrible wildfires this year, and so events like that, they grind things to a halt, and that affects a lot of people, not just actors and directors, but everybody
Yeah.
who does anything in the support industries. So we're all hopeful that things start popping really soon, and in the meantime, it's winter here, so that's when nature tells me to stay inside and work on my art. So that's what I'm going to do anyway.
I'm
Yeah.
sure my co-host is gonna love to hear that you're working on a horror Lovecraftian story. That's
Ooh, yeah.
absolutely his deal. So he will
Excellent.
be just out of this world.
Oh, great, great. Well, I can't wait to share it. And because it's mine, I can share whatever I want.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, I'm
Sweet.
looking forward and good luck trying to get into Artman and working with the other guys as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.